Well, you may remember from last Wednesday night, we talked about the kings of Israel, starting from the first king being Saul, down through the time that the kingdom divided under the reign of Rehoboam. You may remember we talked about the fact that 10 of those tribes, they separated off. They went to the north. They took Jeroboam as their king, and they established a kingdom that they gave the name Israel. And we talked about the fact that during those years, and you may remember we're talking about leading up to the reign of Jehoram. He was the last of the kings that we talked about with Israel before we broke for our summer series. We find that during that period of time, there were 7 different kings that reigned over Israel, and those kings were a part of 4 different kingly families. It seemed that Israel was constantly in a period of inner turmoil, constant turnover of leadership. There was so many issues taking place in that kingdom that was not really taking place, at least to that extent, in the kingdom of Judah during those years. You may remember that Judah was the kingdom that the tribes of Judah and Benjamin had remained along with a descendant of David. And the descendants of David were promised to always be seated on the throne of that kingdom. Well, where we left off in talking about Judah was with Rehoboam. When Rehoboam came to the end of his life, his son, a man by the name of Abijam, came to the throne. Very little is known about this man. He only reigned for 3 years. But we find that it would be during that 3-year period that the nations of Judah and Israel would fight for the first time. There was always some tension there, especially on the part of Israel. There was always some jealousy taking place, and so there was always contention. Even though they were relatives of each other, we would call them essentially cousins of each other, there was always some tension taking place. And so it was during this time that this first battle took place and Judah was victorious. And really the only reason that they were victorious, it wasn't because Abijam was a good man. In fact, the Bible describes him as being a sinful man, a wicked man. He did not do as God would have him to do. But the sole reason why Judah won that battle is because before they went into battle, Abijam called the nation together and encouraged them to basically depend upon the promises and the protection of God. He called upon God, the nation called upon God for victory. Of course, Israel did not do this. They were worshiping false gods at this time, and so they were victorious. Well, after just 3 years, Abijam dies, and his son Asa becomes the king of Judah. Now, Asa is remembered as one of the good kings. You may remember from our study last week, we talked about the fact that during the history of Judah that they had several good kings that tried to do the right thing, tried to turn the people back to God. But with Israel, you did not have any good kings. They were all wicked. Well, Asa is the first in the line of what we would refer to as good kings of Judah. Now, the first thing that he set out to do was to remove idols from the land. He went through and the places of worship that had been erected to false gods, those were removed. And he sought to restore the worship of the one true God. So he's starting out on a good foot. But we find that while he was very effective in the early years of his reign, that effectiveness began to wane the longer that he was in office. The longer he was in that position of authority, the less ability it seemed that he had to lead. And we find that after 41 years, he was one of the longest reigning kings. After 41 good years, we find that Asa, he came to be afflicted, and the Bible doesn't really give us a lot of details about it. he came to be afflicted by a debilitating foot disease. And this essentially made him bedridden. He wasn't able to lead the way that he needed to. And after 41 years, he died. Well, after Asa's death, his son, a man by the name of Jehoshaphat, became the king of Judah. And Jehoshaphat is also remembered as a good king. The Bible tells us that he walked in the ways of his father. He did those things that were pleasing unto God. But we find that during his reign, he made what we would call a couple missteps. He did a couple of things that really God wasn't pleased with. One of the things, he allowed idol worship to come back into the land. He would not allow it in the more prominent locations, but in some of these obscure, out-of-the-way places, on a mountaintop out in the wilderness somewhere, that's okay. But he wasn't going to allow that in Jerusalem. He wasn't going to allow that in their major cities. But also, another thing that he did that was completely against what God had commanded, he entered into an unlawful alliance with the king of Israel. They were facing war. They were facing some enemies that were coming in trying to attack the land. And so that they would have a stronger front to go up against these battles, against these enemies, he allied himself with one of the kings of Israel. And if it wasn't bad enough doing that, the king that he allied himself with was King Ahab. The one that up to this point was the most wicked of all of the kings that had reigned. But overall, Jehoshaphat, he reigned for 25 years, and it was pretty much a prosperous time. It was a time of peace. He was remembered, other than these two missteps, he was remembered as a good king, and a lot of good things took place in that nation at that time. But what we're going to find tonight is that after the death of Jehoshaphat, Judah is going to take a turn for the worse. They're going to go through a very dark time.